we're historians because we're interested in people, right? History is a humanities discipline. It's about humans. And all of these aspects that we've been discussing, I mean, they're a way of getting into the mindsets of people with all their limitations and blind spots and kind of problems that we can observe. But it's a way of thinking about how people made sense of the world around them.
Hello and welcome. You're listening to The Next Page, the podcast of the Library and Archives dedicated to advancing the conversation on multilateralism. I'm Amy Smith, and today we're going to be talking about intellectual cooperation. It's been about 100 years since the International Institute for Intellectual Cooperation was created in 1925 in Paris. And we're here to talk about all of this intellectual cooperation at the time of the League of Nations from the establishment of the International Committee in Geneva. And with me here today, we have two special guests. Martin Grandjean is a senior researcher and lecturer in contemporary history and digital humanities at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. And Daniel Laqua is professor of modern and contemporary history at Northumbria University in the UK. Please would you introduce yourselves, each of you, and tell us a bit more about your specializations and main research interests.
Thank you for having me. So I'm Martin Grandjean, working at the University of Lausanne on intellectual cooperation, mostly for the last 10 years. I'm specialized in the use of digital technology for historical research. So intellectual cooperation is really the topic I worked on for a few years. But my main interest is to try to understand how digital tools can help us do historical research when dealing with large, massive archives, massive data sets based on historical records.
It's fascinating research. And so are the interactive network mapping and everything that you do. It really makes it extremely visual and easy to understand. Professor Laqua.
Yes, so I'm Daniel Laqua. I'm a historian of internationalism, and the term internationalism, I guess, is no longer quite en vogue as it used to be in the time periods that I've been looking at, which is basically what you might call the long 20th century. So from the late 19th century to the early 21st century. And internationalism describes, of course, a wide range of different efforts to forge bonds across national borders. And in this context, I've been looking at many different political and social movements that cooperated transnationally, that included, the efforts of socialists, of pacifists, of humanitarians. But I've also been interested in the history of international organizations, and in that context have worked quite extensively on the League of Nations as well.
Fascinating. Today, you're both here at the Palais des Nations for an event. We're going to be launching a publication by the archives here. Tell us a bit more about the context of this publication. Where did the idea come from, and how did you get involved as editors?
I think it came from the 2022 conference that we organized here at Library and Archives around the centenary of the International Committee on Intellectual Cooperation. That was organized because I spent most of my days the years before here at the archives, browsing all these old books and records and meeting with the people here, the colleagues at the UN, and in the end, writing a PhD thesis in 2018. And when the centenary approached, I was like, would be very nice to make something, to try to gather a small community around this centenary and to try to see if there are other colleagues working on the subject as well. And it worked very well. We invited a lot of people answered the call, and we had a nice little event here at the UN in Geneva. And after this event, we thought, maybe it would be nice to make a book out of this kind of gathering of very nice colleagues. So that's where I discussed that with the staff here, and I told them I would really like to involve Daniel Laqua in this process. And they were like, you can also, for us, it's okay. You can also do that alone. And I took the courage to write to Daniel to ask if he was interested.
Yeah, I was very pleased to get involved in this project. I had attended the conference that was the centenary conference for the formation of the International Committee on Intellectual Cooperation. So 100 years after the 1922 formation of that committee. And that was a great conference that Martin and the colleagues from the United Nations Library and Archives had organized. It was really nice for me to get involved in working on intellectual cooperation again, because the way that academic careers and academic research work, sometimes you start working on something and then you move on to other things. So in my case, I had worked previously on intellectual cooperation because my doctoral research in the early 2000s, well, 2004 to 2008 or so, had been concerned with Brussels as a center of intellectual cooperation, internationalism, political campaigns as well. But in that context, I'd worked on two protagonists of Belgian internationalism, Paul Hotelet and Henri Lafontaine, who had actually argued for the formation of an intellectual branch of the League of Nations. And that had led me to kind of continue working a bit on those efforts and to see what came out of that. And in 2011, I had published two articles, one in the Journal of Global History, which looked at how intellectual cooperation worked within the League of Nations and how it related to concepts of global order. And then one article in a French journal, Critique Internationale, which looked at the tension between nationalism and internationalism as it played out in the efforts of the League of Nations on intellectual and cultural matters. So obviously 2011, things have moved on, and it was great to see how much work there was. And when I saw that conference that Martin and colleagues had organized, it was fantastic to see how much work there had been and how much ongoing interest there was in these activities. And this is why I thought, okay, when Martin asked me, I said, yes, I want to get involved in that. It'll be great.
That's really amazing. I have to admit, I made a mistake. I read the book backwards. So I was very relieved when I got to your introduction, and it helps address some of the confusion that I was feeling about intellectual cooperation. You note in the introduction how the historian Johann Huizinga said at the time that the translation from French to English of coopération intellectuelle had caused some difficulties at the time, but that in sort of true internationalist manner, intellectual cooperation was to be used as English words, but in the French sense. So I was very curious to try and understand how this sort of translation could help generate a common understanding of what intellectual cooperation is exactly, and what would then be the scope of the International Committee.
Yeah, I think, that's a great question to start with, because I think to many people who work in English, the term intellectual cooperation will probably sound a bit strange. It's not something that people use in everyday language. And I think as a first step, we need to bear in mind that when the League of Nations was formed, English was not the sole lingua franca in international life. French was still a very significant part of diplomacy. And so when the League of Nations operated, people often used concepts and terms that had French origin, and they did that in French. And actually in our book, there's a whole chapter about translation practices as well. So that's a nice aspect. So as I already mentioned, some of those ideas about having a part of the League of Nations that would deal with intellectual and cultural matters came from Belgians. There were also French politicians who were very much involved in promoting that idea. And so the concepts that they used, of course, had been shaped and articulated initially in the French language. So they used coopération intellectuelle. In practice, what this was meant to describe was a whole range of different ways in which people could cooperate on cultural, scientific, academic matters. So it could refer to the cooperation of intellectuals, a kind of, vaguely defined constituency. It could also relate to any form of joint activity in the intellectual realm. So it was quite vague, but as we also note in our introduction, it did give some rise to misunderstandings. And also amongst Anglophone audiences, as the historian Thomas Irish has shown, there was some reluctance because the notion of the intellectual was one that didn't quite have so much appeal in parts of the Anglophone world. But I think, Martin, you've noted that actually there was also something positive about using this kind of somewhat peculiar term, right?
Yeah, I think that the use of an umbrella term to describe intellectual cooperation is also something that has been consciously chosen by the League of Nations Secretariat, so that to avoid, or at least to create a term that would not be already in use in different member states, so that they made sure that this was something that was, it's a bit like coining publicity terms so that it's very clear that the League of Nations is doing something very specific or it's their own doing, and also to try to avoid different, more precise denominations that were proposed by some early promoters of intellectual cooperations like your Belgians and the French, especially the French. They really wanted to keep the word education in the title because they wanted the League of Nations to really enter the discussion about educating young people in different countries so that peace could be made between the countries if we educate the younger generation correctly. And it raised a lot of positions in the Assembly of the League of Nations from other countries that didn't want it, especially the French, to rewrite their own history and their own textbooks in an internationalist way, because they wanted, the 1920s, even after the Great War, was a moment where nation states were still thinking in terms of a nationalist agenda. So using a term like intellectual cooperation is a way to find a vague term to try to encompass everything so that everyone can come at the table with what they want. And then we see what happens, and that's really how this committee was built in the very first years. People come at the table; they are scientists, they are people from the arts, politicians, and we see what happens. Don't write something that is too precise.
So it really was quite an innovative term and idea to get all these intellectuals together in some way. And you started to mention all the very broad topics that it was going to deal with somehow. Why was the League so interested in intellectual cooperation?
Well, when we think about the origins of the League of Nations, of course, we need to think about the context of having been formed in the aftermath of a war that was catastrophic and that had, resulted in widespread death and devastation. And so, of course, the very idea of a League of Nations was to build peace. To take an active step towards a more peaceful international order. Of course, the way that the League of Nations emerged was in a context of diplomatic negotiations. There were many disappointments quite early on with the way that the League had been constructed, but it was already at its outset meant to be a body that had a very diverse agenda. It wasn't just about security. It was about very practical steps in, say, the humanitarian realm, for instance, in the realm of health and many other areas. But actually, kind of cultural, academic, intellectual matters were not part of the League remit initially. So it was part of a process. It was part of a debate, as I've already hinted at, which is why it took until 1922 before the League of Nations was really, in a position where it formed a committee on intellectual cooperation. And we can look at this from two angles. One is if we skip forward a little bit in time, and, often people speak about these kinds of interwar ventures linked to the League of Nations as a forerunner of UNESCO. And the UNESCO Constitution or Charter of UNESCO has this wonderful phrase that's about wars starting in the minds of people. And so this is why the defenses of peace have to be constructed. It's in inverted commas, a slight paraphrase. But so really, if you want to build peace, you also have to deal with education. You have to deal with culture. This is the only way to really build a sustainable peace. And that was one key aspect. So it was an internationalist vision, the idea of fostering the attitudes and mindsets to forge international cooperation and to make another war less likely. The second aspect was very practical. And this is that I've mentioned the devastation caused by the First World War. And even in 1920, 1921, 1922, that was still something that post-war societies were wrestling with. And in any situation where there's a lot of urgent problems to deal with, like universities, academics, research, culture, and so on, they're not necessarily the top priority. And that meant that actually in many countries that had been quite hard hit by the war, there was a real crisis in intellectual life, and also really a material crisis faced by academics, by scholars, by artists. And so one of the other areas or reasons why the League of Nations got involved in it, people were saying, well, we need to look at the situation and the plight of people who work in these kinds of settings, because otherwise, if we don't tackle these problems, societies will remain impoverished also in an intellectual sense as well as in a material one. I'm sure that you'll have some other perspectives on the kind of kind of observations on the kind of genesis of intellectual cooperation as an area for the League, right, Martin?
To be short, I think what is interesting in the question is that the fact that the League was not interested in being involved in intellectual cooperation as such. It was not the League. The League doesn't exist. The League is a democracy or is a multilateral parliament. And in this parliament, someone can raise a hand and say, hey, we need that, we want this, etc., etc. And then there is a debate. And at some point, when Léon Bourgeois proposed a resolution, he got a majority of voters to say, yeah, maybe we are okay to create a small committee to discuss these matters, to see if it is worth investigating further. And this is seen as the creation of intellectual cooperation, but that's just a very big parliament with lots of people from different countries discussing a lot of different stuff. And at some point, someone says, yeah, maybe we can just appoint a few people here and give them some time to discuss that and see what happens. So that's not really a big cultural or policy from the League. It's more like a few individuals, a good momentum at some point, a good initiatives that leads to this becoming a small committee and then moving to a bigger organization.
I mean, I wonder whether we could also add, whether actually the formation of these bodies that dealt with these matters and the fact, that these bodies also changed and they were new subcommittees are also a good example of how the League of Nations as a body relates to civil society, or what we call civil society. Because yes, to create the committees and so on, there has to be a diplomat who gets up and proposes something in a diplomatic setting. But the way in which this agenda developed was really the result of a lot of demands from groups within individual societies, from the academic world, from the wider milieus of internationalism. And so it gives us a good example of how the League is also just not just a diplomatic entity, but something that relates to many other kind of groups and constituencies.
That's something very visible in the archives here. When you have folders and folders and folders, hundreds of them, of people reacting to the League of Nations discussing intellectual cooperation and sending proposals. Say, yes, in my country, I want to do this and that. I want to create an international university here. I want to make a new organization for the coordination of this and that, etc., etc. So it created a lot of demand and lot of creativity in the civil society.
So hence the creation of the committee in 22, and it's a small committee and there was a small secretariat attached to it. But then in 1925, you get the creation of the International Institute for Intellectual Cooperation in Paris. So Martin, tell us a little bit more about that and the institutional relationship between the two bodies. It all sounds very complicated when you look at the organigrams. And why was it so complex?
I don't know really why it is so complex, because at the time organizations they started to create this kind of complexity. These are big administrations, so they naturally evolve in this kind of very large organigrams with lots of people that are member of every committee at the same time, etc., etc. But what is interesting in the creation of this institute is the fact that after a few years, the French players in this field realized that France had some kind of specific role to play in intellectual cooperation, and they were able to convince the French government to fund an institute to help intellectual cooperation becoming something really big, or at least bigger than just a non-permanent committee at the League of Nations. So the French minister came and say, okay, no, we are able to fund something, to give money to create an institution that would be hosted by France in Paris, so that it could serve as a permanent secretariat for the Intellectual Cooperation Committee, which is really seen by most historians as a way for France to make sure that they had the hand on this dynamic, so that they would, of course, fund it, so they would appoint a lot of officials there and make sure that France would always be very well represented in this dynamic. So they really tried to bring to Paris a few things that were done in Geneva, because they were probably also wanting to ensure that the cultural role of France would prevail in lots of these diplomatic discussions around culture and science. So they created this institute. They put a French scholar at the head of the institute, and they started to use it as a second League of Nations in Paris.
Daniel.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, this is also a good example of how the kind of things that we're discussing here relate to broader historical processes. And I think there's two aspects here. The first is that seen from that angle, we can see the creation of that institute as an example of what we nowadays call cultural diplomacy, right? So this idea that states think, okay, diplomacy is not just about negotiations and asserting yourself in the political arena. It's also about soft power, about promoting your own culture and civilization, but in an international setting. In our book, we've got many other examples of how other countries try to do that, including fascist Italy, actually. So that idea, and there's quite a bit of historical research now that highlights that actually the 1920s and 30s are a crucial era for shaping cultural diplomacy. And then the second aspect about this kind of question about the role of France also highlights this broader issues about how ideas about nationhood and ideas about international community in a kind of very dynamic relationship with one another. So France says we should have an international institute, but it should be based in Paris. And of course, it is based on this idea that France is a particularly civilized and cultured country. So in that sense, kind of these national and international visions, they intersect.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and yes, of course. So 3 years later, 1928, it's mushroomed. The institute has 140 staff or so, and people are starting to find this perhaps a little too French. I think you're right that it was considered as sustaining a French hegemony. And in 1930, then, this caused the writing of a report drawing attention to extravagant spending and fanciful management and so on. And the head left, and Henri Bonnet, who was formerly working at the information section at the League in Geneva, was brought in. And by 1931, 50% of the staff had been cut. So, Martin, would you explain a little bit more about the debate around that and the tensions between the autonomy of the Institute?
Yeah, it's very clear that very early on, Julien Luchaire, the first director of the Institute, really tried to make the Institute the biggest institution as possible. He really wanted to use the funds that were allocated to it to really make it a very functional and large organization, which is good because what intellectual cooperation needed at the time was trying to connect people together. So you need a lot of people to do that. You need a lot of secretaries. You need personnel to write to people and to gather information about the situation of intellectual life in different countries, etc., etc. But the problem is, of course, that it created redundancies with the League of Nations Secretariat in Geneva. It created a competition between them. And we see in the archives very well messages from Geneva or from Paris that says to Paris or Geneva, hey, this subject was supposed to be a subject that we were supposed to work on here in Geneva, and you're not supposed to talk about that in Paris, etc. And in Paris, you would send a mail to Geneva to say, hey, this specific university in Eastern Europe, we were in contact with, you're not supposed to write to them, etc., etc. So this competition was a bit problematic. What was problematic also is the fact that the committee was still in charge. The International Committee on Intellectual Cooperation was supposed to be in charge of all this, but it was just a dozen or 24 people gathered around the table here in Geneva once a year for 2 or 3 weeks during the League of Nations Assembly meetings. So that means that just a few scientists sitting around a table, they can't really be the board of director of an institute that is working all day, every day, 100 people in the same building. Is clearly something that is not doable. They were not able to really have the control on what was done in Paris. So that's why they decided to reform this organization and to appoint someone that was a bit more Geneva compatible at the head of the institute. Henri Bonnet was still a Frenchman, so we are still in the compromise with France. We keep the good relations. We appoint a Frenchman there, even if the statutes were mentioning clearly that normally the director had to come from a different country each time anyone is appointed. So this reform was, of course, a bad moment for Julien Luchaire, clearly. He was clearly, well, I mean, he said he wanted to leave, but in fact, he was really forced by the other French around him that said it was his time to go. But it was probably good for intellectual cooperation as a whole to make sure that the people who were really at the helm of the ship were the scientists, the scholars, and not the administration in Paris itself.
Mm. At the same time, the book is littered with very recognizable names of eminent scientists and scholars, and of course there were very high-ranking civil servants from Europe and North America and working in French and English. To what extent was intellectual cooperation an elite project? And, just reproducing hierarchies of class and gender and region, whilst talking about international peace and universal culture. Daniel?
Thanks. Yeah, I think we need to acknowledge these limitations. It was an elitist project in many respects. Often when officials or other protagonists of intellectual cooperation thought about engaging with publics, with different audiences, even that idea of who that public was quite limited in various ways. And I think we need to acknowledge that the League of Nations, including the bodies that we've studied here, operated in a deeply unequal and deeply unjust world. And we can see this certainly when it comes to questions of empire and race, kind of inverted commas, where there wasn't really a critical probing. And there's a real difference between the League of Nations efforts and what happens within UNESCO, which becomes a forum for much more diverse voices and debates on those kinds of questions. So I think it's really important to say, well, obviously there's a lot of kind of innovative aspects that happen within or under the umbrella of intellectual cooperation, kind of dealing with national prejudices, thinking about international action in a lot of different fields, but it cannot quite overcome the way in which kind of imperial hierarchies and mindsets shape the world in that period in the 1920s and 30s. The same goes for class. There is some engagement with questions, for instance, of the impoverished intellectuals. So in that sense, they're not necessarily, all wealthy people in material terms, but of course, kind of in terms of engaging with working class protagonists, there are limitations certainly that one needs to acknowledge. But we got to gender, we tackle that question about gender imbalances and gender representation quite directly in the book. So there's quite a detailed study that contributors to our book have done, looking at different forms of gender representation within the League of Nations, within the bodies for intellectual cooperation. And then also there are some particular individuals who pop up quite frequently. So there's a specific chapter on Gabriele Radziwiłł, who certainly was a person who came from a very privileged background. She was a Lithuanian princess, but at the same time was a woman who had a very significant career within the League of Nations system. And so we've seen kind of how individual cases could overcome the kind of some of the challenges of operating also in a deeply gendered system. And that's something that we're very interested in when it comes to the League of Nations efforts in intellectual cooperation. Don't know whether you have further.
No, I think unfortunately what these studies shows is that intellectual cooperation was even worse in terms of gender balance than most of other League of Nations bodies, especially because it was a place where people were elected because of their international fame and not because they were good at administration and diplomacy. So the thing is that, of course, if you select people based on this fame, you will have Albert Einstein and Harry Bergson and a very few Marie Curie at this time.
Yeah, Christina Bonnevie as well, right? So that, but I think it's interesting. So that actually, because one key element is of intellectual cooperation is the academic world and engagement with the academic world, it also reflects some of the biases of the academic world in that period.
Exactly.
You've mentioned UNESCO several times already, and of course the League's work on intellectual cooperation paved the way in many ways for UNESCO to be formed. But to what extent do you think that a multilateral organisation should be the guardian, a broker of intellectual cooperation, in a world where knowledge and science is very deeply politicised?
I think it's interesting to see that being a guardian of intellectual cooperation is something that is part of the missions of UNESCO, but it was clearly not that easy in the 20s for intellectual cooperation for the committee in 1920. In the 1920s, this role was clearly not recognized for the League of Nations. It was clearly not, as Daniel said, it was clearly not in the covenant of the League to tackle this question. The cultural and scientific organizations at the time, they were doing very well without the League of Nations. They didn't want this competition with a new multilateral organization. While in the 50s or 40s, but then 50s, when UNESCO became a big thing, it was more natural to have an institution that would be the guardian of this. Maybe because, and that could be one of the fruitful failure of intellectual cooperation, maybe because the intellectual cooperation had shown that it was possible, or it was normal maybe in the global landscape of international organizations that something like that existed. So I don't necessarily want to say if it's a good thing or not that these kind of things now are more or less a situation we live in, where UNESCO is recognized as the place where people will, or countries will go for labelization of global heritage. But it's interesting to see that it was clearly not logical for people in the 20s, while it was probably much more the case for the 40s or 50s.
I mean, I would also say that, you've asked about a multilateral organization. Well, what's the alternative? I mean, because all of these areas, culture, science, I mean, as you say, they're deeply politicized. But that also means that even if you have another kind of international organization, like a non-multilateral one, a lot of the same problems will emerge as well. And I think that boils down to the broader aspect. I mean, the kind of ventures that we've studied here coexisting with many others, just like UNESCO and other institutions nowadays are coexisting with a whole range of other non-governmental efforts as well. So I think there's never just one broker or one guardian for activity in the cultural or scientific realm, but having kind of a forum where both non-governmental and state actors can cooperate and engage in dialogue, I think is essential because precisely there is a kind of deeply politicized element to all of that. So you need to have these fora.
And it's also a place where minorities or countries that were not very well represented on the global cultural scene, where they can try to shine in a certain way. That's something that happens at the very end of the period of intellectual cooperation, where lots of countries realize that intellectual cooperation is not just for France and Great Britain, but it might also be for them, and they will try to get involved in that to create from scratch their own cultural policies and cultural diplomacy. That's especially the case for some countries in South America, where they realize in the 30s that there is a space here, and they've not been really involved in that, but it doesn't cost a lot to get involved and to take some space and to express their own cultural identity, etc.
That's actually quite a nice point. Thinking about the book, we begin in Paris and Geneva, I guess, in the first chapter because that's the introduction, but the final chapter ends in Buenos Aires.
Exactly. So it's gone around the world. The institute in Paris, of course, closed in 1940 as war was encroaching upon the city. And although the doors did open again briefly post-war, in the introduction, you quote the last director of the institute, Jean-Jacques Mayou, who wrote that we are astonished to find that so much has been done from nothing with nothing. And I noted that one of the chapters written by Gabriel Gavaz-Beha frames the experiments in intellectual cooperation as fruitful failure, which I think is a wonderful term. And yet, in some way, the initiatives help reshape fields like scientific research and education and cultural heritage. And you've just noted how people started recognizing around the world that this actually mattered and mattered for their country as well. Would you each perhaps share an example of the activities that were undertaken? Because we've talked about it in a very broad manner.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there's really a whole range of different areas. I mean, the kind of intellectual cooperation efforts involve work on museums, on heritage preservation, which is being tackled in our book as well, and kind of thinking about what that means in terms of preserving monuments. And those kinds of efforts, they don't stop when the League of Nations collapses. I mean, that basically forms part of a wider trajectory. Same applies to the kind of discussions that Gabriel Gavaz-Beha, whose kind of notion of fruitful failure you've mentioned, tackles, namely kind of the material interests of academics, intellectuals, including scientific property. And there are historians like Isabelle Allure who've worked on that as well. There's a broader history of thinking about intellectual property rights, which the League of Nations works on, and some of these efforts also continue. What I'm particularly interested in is the educational realm. So the League of Nations was a forum for debates about textbook reform, for instance, as a way of peace building, something that didn't go very far because states were quite keen to protect their own education systems and not to have too much meddling. But this idea that actually you should think about how history is being taught, how maybe school teaching can reinforce prejudice is quite significant. And that, again, is something that continues into the post-war era. One of my own areas of research concerns university students as actors on the global stage. And one thing that I was really fascinated by was that in the 1920s, the League of Nations got really interested in promoting student exchanges because they thought students were the leaders of the future. So they worked with student organizations and they created an international student identity card, which was meant to be like a travel document. It was meant to unlock various discounts. And again, this is something that kind of continues in the post-war world. I mean, I remember when I was a student, I had this ISIC card, which is like a successor, which allowed me to kind of get cheap tickets on the Eurostar and so on. So we can see that all of this doesn't just happen in a silo. It doesn't happen in a limited time period, but it's part of a longer history.
Yeah, I think it makes it hard to name concrete examples because time has passed. Also, if you just think about the time that has passed since Second World War, it's already quite a lot. But I think what is really interesting in intellectual cooperation is the fact that it created a fertile ground for a lot of initiatives, like Daniel mentioned, a fertile ground for the study of international relations. I mean, the International Studies Conference started also in this context, has been sponsored through the League of Nations and intellectual cooperation in its first years. Fertile ground for the recognition of the need of heritage preservation, as you said, with the Office International des Musées, but also lots of other initiatives like that. It created a precedent. It created something that helps future organizations to ground what they were doing in history already, to say we tried that already in the 20s and 30s, so now we are continuing this but of course not a lot of the things that were created in the 20s still exist today. I mean, it would be an illusion to think that this kind of the world changed a lot since the 20s. So
but it opened doors.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, created this ground, creating these common references around the fact that culture is something that can be discussed at an international level.
I think I should have asked you this earlier, but I was really interested in the way you took up this topic of intellectual cooperation, because earlier historiography has often treated intellectual cooperation as a bit, more symbolic than effective and marginal really to the League's story. What led you to thinking of it as opening a window onto broader questions of international order?
I think I came to studying intellectual cooperation because I was fascinated by the fact that it was possible at some point to put all those big minds in the same room together. And I really started with this fascination for all these people that were brought together. And then I started to realize that they needed this practical setting. They needed to be. You don't just need a table to put the people around the table. You need an administration. You need trains. You need boats to move people, and then you need a lot of people writing reports. You need a lot of people running from an office to another to bring the report, etc., etc. And I think, to me, intellectual cooperation is a way of trying to bridge the study of scientific and academics, intellectual history, to the history of international administration, basically, to understand that even if we are speaking about what has always been called a league of minds, to try to put another definition to what intellectual cooperation could be, it is really much an administration in itself. It's really an organization with lots of secretaries, with lots of little hands signing papers and writing drafts, and this is telling us a lot about what we really do in the daily life of an international organization. So I think this is when you look at the broader picture, and when you think in terms of the questions of international order or 20th century history, it's always interesting to use this kind of cases to realize that in fact it's not just like big minds meeting or big head of states that are just signing a document and agreeing and shaking hands, but that's also a whole panorama, a whole galaxy of people around them that tries on a daily basis to make things work. And this is a good example of the discrepancy between this level of the big minds, of the big diplomats and the big scientists, and the level of the people that really do the work at the ground level.
I would say as well, I mean, kind of signing documents and reports. I mean, that may sound very dry, but ultimately, I mean, we're historians because we're interested in people, right? History is a humanities discipline. It's about humans, and all of these aspects that we've been discussing, I mean, they're a way of getting into the mindsets of people with all their limitations and blind spots and kind of problems that we can observe. But it's a way of thinking about how people made sense of the world around them, you know, whether that was through education, through the idea of heritage, or all these other aspects that we've mentioned. So that's really, it's a window into a much wider world. And that also means that we've taken the individuals seriously who engaged with this. We've looked at this from different levels, but I think it does tell us something about how people looked at the world, which we now look at as the interwar world. But for of course, the people living at that time, it was kind of open-ended. They didn't think, okay, we're living in the interwar period. And so I think it's really fascinating because it does open up much broader questions.
It does. So as we close, I'd like to end with the question that you start with, which is, can the act of gathering a range of intellectuals around a table build better international understanding?
I'm really convinced it is not the gathering of these intellectuals that will build better international understanding. But I want to be a bit provocative and say that yes, in fact, even the simple publicity of putting these people in the same room together was at the time working in this sense. A bit like today, we see a lot of celebrities that become ambassadors for I don't know what, and these celebrities, they still we can find that a bit funny, but they still help people understand that there is something that is happening at this multilateral level. And you'll see them, some tennisman or a cinema star, saying a speech about, I don't know, UNESCO or UN, etc. And they are the people who can make the population realize that something is happening there. So I will say that, yes, maybe the publicity of having all these people in the same room, the example to see, okay, we can put a German and a French in the same room in 1922, that's already a good example. But of course, that's not really what we show when we do the history of that. What we show is that, in fact, those big minds and those gatherings were not really as effective as what we might have thought.
I would say, I mean, my answer would be not only, but also, if you ask, you know, can putting people together around a table solve problems? Because, you know, you need to be able to speak to others, and especially in these highly politicized areas, highly contested areas where, you know, you're dealing with national antagonisms and so on. You have to have people who are involved in education, in academic research and so on, engage in dialogue with one another and to overcome their differences. So in that sense, yes. But it can't be the only route. And I think one of the things that we've already pointed at is the fact that, you know, I think you have to have a much more democratic vision of what these kinds of exchanges should entail. I mean, you have to kind of make the kind of transition to actually facilitating dialogue amongst a much broader cast of, you know, people. And I think that's where we can see also the constraints and the limitations of the arrangements that we've been discussing in this book.
I heard no, yes, and also. That's a fantastic way to end. But I would just like, you've said so much and you've shared so much, but could you perhaps just very briefly say something about an important legacy of intellectual cooperation from that time that remains relevant today?
I think it was a testing ground for cultural diplomacy, and this is what we owe to intellectual cooperation today. The fact that we tested the fact that at some point people tested this kind of setting, this kind of gathering of people and different nations and different cultures together. Didn't work as expected, but it really laid the foundations for what came after.
I think the other aspect that's quite an important legacy is to overcome compartmentalization or over, you know, specialization. I mean, the idea that you have to have a holistic treatment that actually brings together different areas of human activity and human endeavors and treat them as interconnected, rather than saying, here's an organization that will just deal with school-based education, and here's an organization that deals with academic exchanges, and here's a kind of a forum to discuss international relations, and let's think about monuments or so. No, all of these are things that are intertwined, and so they need to be also appreciated in terms of their interrelations as well. And I think that's an important legacy, precisely because of the point that we started with, namely the fact that this was a very open-ended idea, or like a very open idea, intellectual cooperation. So it had that elastic nature that allowed people to kind of stretch it so far that it could actually encompass quite a lot.
What a wonderful way to end. Thank you so much, Daniel Laqua and Martin Grandjean. Thank you for joining us today, and good luck with the panel and the launch of the book.
Thank you.
Thank you.